Thank you so much to the Association for the Study of African Life and History for the opportunity to share this research that has become our book in Bleaching the Curriculum, Enhancing Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Beyond in Schools and Society. I am Dr. Annette Teasdale, an assistant professor of curriculum and instruction at Clark Atlanta University. It is my pleasure to share with you all a little bit of our research and encourage you to read more about our work and what it means for this important contribution to African American history and culture. I have a few slides that highlight some of the contributions from the book that I'll share now. First, it's so important for us to acknowledge the seminal work of Dr. Carter G. Woodson and his contributions in the seminal text, The Miseducation of the Negro. What we find today is that there is a considerable amount of miseducation that is still occurring in today's schools and societies. And so, in unbleaching the curriculum, we attempt to address some of those challenges. We're proud to have the endorsements of Lavon Neal, who says that unbleaching the curriculum is an innovative transformation blueprint for multicultural education to spark the genius of all students. And also Alicia Moore, who says, the authors of this book courageously present unbleaching as a means of protest, a protest that inherently interrogates the ideologies of nationalism, racism, and other systems of oppression that have historically been hallmarks of integrated schooling. It is very important for us to think about where we are now and how, with the curriculum, we can make changes to improve the outcomes for students in U.S. schools. As I begin today, I honor my colleagues and co-authors, Dr. Greg Wiggin, who is the professor of urban education at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, Dr. Marcia Watson Vandiver, who is the associate professor of elementary education at Towson University, and Dr. Shakia Talley Matthews, an educational researcher who holds a doctorate in curriculum and instruction from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Together, we collaborated on this important work because we felt the need to address key curricular and pedagogical issues in education, particularly those that disrupt miseducation and advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in schools and beyond. One of the things that I'd like to highlight is why this is important, why the curriculum matters. When we think about the curriculum, when we think about education in our schools, education can be a great source of social mobility, liberation, and healing. But our students are experiencing all types of trauma and curriculum violence in schools. They're being suspended and expelled and excluded from the educational process in disproportionate numbers. They are being tracked into low-level courses that prohibit them from access to higher education. They are also even forced out of schools. And so it's important that we collectively look at how this impacts us and what we need to be doing about it now. The curriculum, we know, when it reflects the contributions of all learners, has a higher likelihood of student empowerment and achievement across the United States, not just for Black and Brown students, but across the board, performance is a major issue. The curriculum can serve as a pathway for education, as a source of healing and liberation. In this book, we unveil the unbleaching framework, which we define as the process of disrupting Eurocentrism and symptoms of oppression that undermine, suppress, falsify, dehumanize, and marginalize non-Europeans and their perspectives and contributions as conduits for creating, maintaining power and privilege. The unbleaching framework is very important to providing a definitive answer to scaffold the results of those suppressions and omissions that prohibit DEI processes in schools and society. And so when we look at what's happening in our country, we know that books are being banned just at the wishes of any individual who chooses to make a claim that it is detrimental. We have valuable resources that are being made unavailable to our students. Our students are being taught things that we know can impact them not only in what they're learning in schools, but in their life choices. When we look at all of the challenges that have occurred, particularly as it relates to the AP African American Studies courses, to restrictions in what can and cannot be taught in schools, then we know that now is the time to speak up about how we need to unbleach the curriculum. When we look at the whitewashing in African American studies, and as it relates to the inclusion and contributions of people of African descent, there is work to be done. And this book begins to challenge that. We say that for students in US public schools, a bleached and whitewashed curriculum omits or suppresses key contributions, which generally result in curriculum violence and miseducation. Now, we know that, and we do honor the contributions of a Solace Black History Bulletin as a supplement to the curriculum that is being taught in schools. We know the curriculum can be viewed as a series of lessons, practices, learning experiences, and student performance assessment taught in an academic program. In my experiences as a native of South Carolina, there were several key omissions. We never learned about the Stono Rebellion, which took place just 20 minutes from where I grew up and where it was being taught in schools. We rarely spoke of the contributions of Mary McLeod Bethune, who is a South Carolina native and was born in Maysville, and who, with $1.25, established what we now know as Bethune-Cookman University. And so it's very important that we think about what these omissions and suppressions mean for us. Here's a QR code so that you can order your own copy of the book. But in 7 chapters, we investigate curriculum design, pedagogical omissions, and suppressed contributions of minoritized groups in schools and society to create greater DEI. In this book, we talk about an important contribution that is often omitted. And I use the words of this young man as a means to segue this discussion. and I call it the Tale of Two Kings. In this letter, King reflects on his experiences. He says, "Today was not a good learning day. Blah, blah, blah. I only wanted to not hear you talk. You said something wrong, and I can't listen when I hear lies. My mom says that the only Christopher we acknowledge is Wallace, because Columbus didn't find our country, the Indians did. I like to have Columbus Day off, but I want to not hear you teach me lies. That is all. My question for the day is, how can white people teach Black history?" And the teacher responds, "King, I am very disappointed in your journal today." Of course, King says, "Okay." King is not unlike the king that we see here, El Rey, was discovered in 1955 through the exploits of explorations of Matthew Stirling, who through the National Geographic Society uncovered these Olmec heads. And so in our text, we talk about the contributions of the Olmec and how they're often omitted and what that means for us in schools and societies and beyond. We also, in this book, tackle what we know is the oldest book in the world, The Teachings of Ptah-hotep. This is often omitted when we look at the contributions and what's taught in social studies curricula in schools and society. And so it's very important that we take the opportunity to begin to discuss how these omissions and what they mean can be brought to light for our students. This is not something that we provide as a something we're just talking about, but we encourage readers to view the historical and primary sources in the British Museum. This is an excerpt from the teachings of Ptah-hotep. And so as we begin to think about what this book means, we know that it's written in Medu Neter, and it was written circa 2300 BCE. And we know that Ptah-hotep used his maxims to improve Kemetic civilization and educate his citizens. Now, as we think about curriculum, we know that curriculum reform can be the pathway for education as a source of healing and liberation. Those who hold power control the curriculum. And so in this text, we talk more about not just the Olmec and their contributions and the teachings of Ptah-hotep, but we also talk about numerous other oppressions and submissions that need to be encouraged. This research delivers on the promise of Black higher education because student performance is a national concern that underscores the need for school reform, particularly at the curriculum level. We know that our students are depending on us to not only talk about how important it is to include these stories and these historical facts, but also they're looking to us to spark genius within them in order to address diversity, equity, and inclusion issues more deeply. There's a need for full review of educational processes and practices in U.S. schools and society. Our book, according to Joyce King, says this work is timely and needed as it disrupts miseducation and advances diversity, equity, and inclusion in schools and beyond. It shines a bright light on curricular omissions and provides a corrective framework that enhances instructional knowledge in K-12 and higher education. This book has great implications for social studies and teacher preparation and is a must-read for educators, researchers, curriculum designers, and policymakers. I thank you so much for this opportunity, and I encourage you to share any questions or concerns at atsdel@cau.edu. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Benjamin Weber, a historian, author of American Purgatory, and an African American Studies professor here at the University of California, Davis. I'm excited to share my new book with you. American Purgatory explains how mass incarceration arose out of successive eras of empire building across North America, the Caribbean, the Pacific, and around the globe. It traces an unspoken doctrine of prison imperialism, how U.S. policymakers sought to govern the world through the regulation of crime. Even as prison imperialism extended outwards, it always returned home, producing new forms of social control over a growing number of people ensnared in the prison. Like other colonial practices, the prison system has actually produced racial hierarchy in ever-adapting ways over the past 400 years. So the book uncovers the root causes and continued workings of America's carceral empire, and it also amplifies a long and powerful protest tradition demanding a global view of solutions to this ongoing crisis within and beyond US borders. As we enter the newest age of empire, marked by the rise of e-carceration and the globalization of the supermax prison, it's clear that prison imperialism is not just a creature of the past, but continues to spread US-style structural racism around the world. If you'll permit me to share my screen. These maps that appear in the book are created by my friend and longtime collaborator, Lynn Carlson at Compass Cartographic. beginning with a preemptive strike on the Black Fort, a vibrant African and Native American maroon settlement during the illegal invasion of Spanish, or really Seminole, Florida. U.S. officials set out to prove that prisons would dominate the struggle over placemaking in the first era of continental expansion. Across Florida's panhandle, at Fort Marion Prison in St. Augustine, an Army officer turned warden first experimented with a new system of criminalization, attempting to turn the children of Seminole, Kiowa, Cheyenne, Comanche, Caddo, and Apache Indian prisoners of war into wards of the state. And Richard Henry Pratt's brainchild became the Carlisle Indian Boarding School, from which federal officials developed an interlocking system of dispossession and elimination, separating families between the reservation, the prison, and the rapidly expanding boarding school system. Prison imperialism also lay behind 19th century plans for a national penal colony. In the wake of Gabriel's rebellion in Virginia, and fueled by fears over the revolution by enslaved people in neighboring Haiti, James Monroe and Thomas Jefferson searched for a, quote, non-contiguous territory to transport enslaved and free Black people they deemed criminal. What they came up with, the so-called Jefferson-Monroe Penal Doctrine, was a kind of spatial fix for what they saw as a racial problem. The Jefferson-Monroe Penal Doctrine was evoked in penal colony schemes, revealing the staying power of planning federal penal policy in expansionist terms. Its formulation that racial segregation take territorial form became a mainstay of penal colony proposals introduced by state and national legislators over the course of the 19th century. Indeed, in the middle of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln considered a colonization proposal at the same time as the Emancipation Proclamation sat on his desk. And after the war, many people believed that Secretary of State William Seward's purchase of Alaska would become America's Botany Bay. Although policymakers never did establish a penal colony, by the 1920s, the US government was operating the Iwahig Penal Colony in the Philippines, said to be the largest prison plantation in the world. During that period of aggressive overseas expansion, starting with the Spanish-American War, the US military waged an all-out offensive on the newly independent Philippines. 200,000 Filipinos were killed in the first 3 years. Devastated by this death toll, the Katipunan Revolutionary Brotherhood was forced underground, where they continued to organize for independence. And after declaring an end to the war and transfer from military to colonial rule, US officials continued their counterinsurgency campaigns against uprisings that sprang up around the archipelago, but they shifted from military to police personnel. And supporters of the independence movement against US rule fought for a vision of sovereignty based on kalayaan, an ethic of care and an aspiration of freedom. Perpetually afraid of the rise of a messiah capable of leading the Katipunan would unite the popular uprisings, US officials used criminal transportation to separate these messianic figures from their networks of belonging. And Bilibid Prison in Manila became the hub as colonial governors and police commissioners forcibly transported thousands of people around this vast network of jails across the archipelago, even extending to nearby islands like Guam. And as US officials engineered the rise of a massive surveillance state in the Philippines, they came to rely on criminal transportation as a practice of colonial domination. Now, many of the same military men, police, and prison guards who fought in places like the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico during the Spanish-American War were then tapped to extend prison imperialism into the Panama Canal Zone. When US troops occupied Panama, veterans of Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders assumed posts as police captains and prison wardens, overseeing one of the largest infrastructure building projects in history. Roosevelt selectively extended certain constitutional provisions by executive order to establish a legal architecture in the Canal Zone, instructing federal judges and prosecutors on things like court proceedings, forced labor, and deportation. Now, while he initially chose not to extend jury trial, he was clear that the convict clause, the 13th Amendment's exception for slavery and involuntary servitude to be used as punishment for crime, would apply in this new territorial jurisdiction. As in the US South, bogus charges and sentences to hard labor effectively re-enslaved African-descended peoples, in this case predominantly migrant workers from neighboring Caribbean islands of Jamaica, Barbados, and Martinique. And along with US-style Jim Crow silver and gold roll employee categories, as highly visible and degrading convict labor on road gangs was used to structure racial hierarchy in the Canal Zone. And the Canal Zone became a foothold for progressive era penologists and what were called Good Roads movement boosters, who lobbied for a Pan-American highway from Alaska to Argentina. And they proudly claimed that the convict on the road was a slave of the state, whether in the New South or Panama. And these same progressive era penologists found the fullest expression of their desire to control through hard work and stages of supervision in a so-called prison without walls. These globe-trotting experts actually looked to prisons in American empire as a leading edge of penology. By the 1930s, they held up the Iwahig penal colony in the Philippines as a poster child for the prison without walls. The most remarkable prison in the world, they called it, at the meetings of the American Prison Association at McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary in the Puget Sound, pictured here in 1927, and at the International Prison Commission meetings in Prague in 1930, quote, the prison of tomorrow. In contrast to walled institutions that relied on physical punishment and control, this new sort of prison purported to use a set of incentives, stages of confinement, and an invisible supervision system to maintain order. At Iwahig, prisoners could progress from the barrack zone to the home zone to the, quote, free zone based on compliance and, quote, good behavior. At McNeil, which was also designated a Wallace Island prison, they might earn the privilege of working the, quote, honor farm. And this logic of control through stages of supervision marked debates over intermediate sentencing, indeterminate sentencing, and federal, quote, good time, probation, and parole laws, known in criminology and penology as the Great Triplets. And at the time, US delegates to the International Prison Congresses argued for a perpetual rather than a transactional relation between lawbreakers and the state. As with colonialism generally, at issue was a struggle over where to locate authority to determine readiness for release or fitness for freedom. And they believed that criminality must be exterminated before a prisoner could be released. Drawing on examples from overseas prisons like Iwahig, penologists and policymakers argued that discretion to determine when someone was fit to re-enter society should not lie with judges at sentencing, but rather with criminological experts. And they argued that this would mark a major advance from a system based on retribution to one based on a principle of rehabilitation. And ironically, these advocates for what was called the indeterminate sentence ended up pushing for longer sentences, seeing them as windows of time within which to work on rehabilitating the prisoner. This form of net widening, the process of extending social control through the carceral system, often in the name of reform, is rooted in the colonial logic of prison imperialism. And the imperial boomerang swung back with full force to repress Puerto Rican and Black nationalist movements for self-determination. Black communist organizers like Claudia Jones found themselves persecuted and imprisoned under the Smith and McCarran Acts in the 1940s and 50s, which targeted anyone labeled, quote, dangerous, disloyal, or subversive for imprisonment and deportation in the name of, quote, internal security emergency. She was imprisoned at Alderson Federal Women's Prison, pictured here in this map, where she was joined by Puerto Rican independence fighters Blanca Canales and Lolita Lebron. And Jones's experience in prison sharpened her critique of state violence as she formed feminist and anti-colonial solidarities with what she called her anti-fascista sisters locked behind bars. Blanca Canales was transferred from Puerto Rico to Alderson for her role in the Jayuya uprising against U.S. colonial rule in 1950, which was met with McCarthyism's full fury, including wholesale killing and imprisonment of frontline fighters, passing a gag law based on the Smith Act, and banning the Nationalist Party. Lolita Lebron was sent to Alderson after firing shots during an independence demonstration against the U.S., declaring Puerto Rico a continued colonial holding in 1954. And at Alderson, she likewise developed a thoroughgoing critique of prison imperialism, including a theory of what she called the last recourse, which was published in the Black Panther newsletter in the 1970s. And when Assata Shakur was imprisoned at Alderson in 1978, she sought out Lolita Lebron, who she considered one of the most respected political prisoners in the world. An avid student of liberation, Assata joined the imprisoned Sisterhood of Intellectuals and Activists committed to revealing the deep historical connections between racism, capitalism, and imperialism. Inside prison, reflecting on her experiences being persecuted by the FBI's illegal COINTEL program, she wrote of her dream to abolish racism all over the world. And her vision of Black liberation was formed in relation to Puerto Rican and indigenous movements for self-determination. Indeed, nearly a decade before she was imprisoned at Alderson, she had stood with the Indians of all tribes during their takeover of Alcatraz in 1969. And after Assata was transferred to Clinton Correctional in New York and made her escape in 1979, those two acts, the takeover of Alcatraz and her escape to Cuba, would galvanize the anti-prison movement. The Alcatraz takeover and Assata's escape became enduring lodestones for protest against prison imperialism precisely because they internationalized the struggle. The Alcatraz occupation became a platform for Native Americans' united appeal to the world for sovereignty. As a decommissioned federal prison, it also grounded their movement in the concrete struggle over land. Reclaiming surplus federal lands was an ingenious strategy predicated on restoring treaty rights and shifting the legal burden of proof for criminal trespass charges onto the federal government. And as geographer Ruthie Gilmore has shown, and those familiar with the political economy of prison expansion in California know, the massive prison building boom was driven by a struggle over surplus, as lobbyists and lawmakers leverage a distinct convergence of surplus land, capital, and state capacity, as well as people deemed superfluous in the era of deindustrialization and rising unemployment. Here again, centuries later, policymakers sought a spatial fix through prison expansion to what they wrongly conceived as a racial problem. And the Alcatraz takeover was not about the former prison alone, but extended to other federal lands and reservations. The next Alcatraz was actually a set of occupations planned across Northern California and up through the Puget Sound, Alaska, and Canada. And with the fatal shootout during the occupation of Wounded Knee on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota in 1973, federal officials once again used outsized violence and imprisonment to dominate the struggle over placemaking in the new age of empire marked by the escalating war in Vietnam. Framed for his involvement, Leonard Peltier is now one of the longest held political prisoners in the world. And this place-based vision of justice promised to undo rather than compound the ongoing impacts of prison imperialism. These portraits of the key activists that appear in the book are painted by my friend and brilliant New Orleans-based visual artist, Io Scott. And so, with the hard-won understanding of the limits of state mechanisms to redress state violence, Black political prisoners appealed instead to the world. Members of the Black Panther Party who were persecuted by the FBI's COINTEL program and J. Edgar Hoover's crazed search to eliminate any possible Black messiah developed a deep distrust of the government from personal experience with unspeakable violence and traumatic loss. Beginning with his petition to the United Nations in 1976, Jalil Muntaqim, pictured there, has been at the center of decades of international organizing from inside prison. From his first UN petition to his most recent Spirit of Mandela campaign, Muntaqim has deployed an expanded human rights framework that extends far beyond flawed international institutions in an unequal world system. As the families of Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor, and Philando Castile, and the Chicago activists who traveled to Geneva to charge the US police and prison system with genocide discovered firsthand, the UN is limited in its power to pressure the US to change. Yet activists organizing to internationalize the struggle are demonstrating that the global movement for prison abolition may in fact become a new human rights paradigm. As the outcry over the movement of torture techniques to major American cities from overseas military prisons like Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib raises renewed concern over the consequences of war making at home, the US continues to export its model of mass incarceration abroad. This is what grassroots groups like the Alliance for Global Justice identify as a new age of prison imperialism, beginning at the turn of the 21st century with the globalization of the supermax, prison being exported to countries like Colombia and Brazil and South Africa. And this process is deeply rooted in centuries-long practices of slavery and empire building, which spawned federal policies of elimination, criminal transportation, family separation, containment, excessive sentencing, and the over-reliance on imprisonment. The prison system's now central role in state-making actually rests on hidden practices of empire building. And to reverse course requires reckoning with the deeply rooted histories of racism and colonialism in penology and foreign policy. Usually treated as distinct areas, they actually share a set of foundational theories and continue to employ common assumptions about preemption and deterrence, containment and incapacitation, retribution, and rehabilitation. Examining how these theories were developed into federal policies and implemented on the ground in particular places is essential to understanding prison imperialism's long career. By drawing on a powerful genealogy of protest by imprisoned intellectuals and activists up through the contemporary prison abolition movement, it becomes clear that repairing the harms of prison imperialism is both anti-racist and decolonizing work. Thank you for your time and allowing me to share this book. And I hope you find it compelling. And I look forward to engaging with many of you as you read it and discuss it.
My name is Dr. Artika Tyner, and I am the author of The Inclusive Leader, Taking Intentional Action for Justice and Equity. I wrote this book in direct response to my own work as a DEI professional over the past 20 years. What has this meant for me? That oftentimes we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but the next step, beyond just words, how do we take action for change? That's the premise that inspired me to write the book, to take all of those experiences from doing a student activist and helping to build those student affinity groups to helping as a professional and serving as a vice president of inclusive excellence. Having all of those opportunities come together as a culmination of a book really meant an invitation on how we can build a better world together. And what does that vision look like? It looks like you and I making a commitment to lead change in meaningful ways. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to a few excerpts from the book, while at the same time providing some practical advice on how we can live out some of those principles of inclusive leadership. So the book forward was written by Miguel Ramos, who is formerly the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for the Minnesota Twins, our baseball team in Minnesota. And one of the things that Miguel focused on in the foreword was the importance of how each and every one of us can take on a daily leadership challenge. And what does that challenge look like? Let me tell you a little bit about it. It reads, at the 2019 Twins Diversity Celebration, I challenged the more than 800 community members that attended to imagine a society where all people are treated with dignity, respect, and justice. I wanted them to reflect not only on the beauty of a society where we all come together for a common goal, but also on the work it will take to get there. Out of this conversation came 3 of many action steps that inclusive leaders must take now in order to change the world. The first step that he gives us is that we must speak up. He draws upon the legacy of Dr. King, who made a decision to lift his voice for justice and also gave us all an invitation in his speech, The Drum Major Instinct, for us to be those drum majors for justice. And what does that mean? That just like that drum major that sets the tone for the harmony and the rhythm of a band, we also have the opportunity to set the tone and the rhythm and build the harmony for society. That is a call to leadership. The second challenge that Mr. Ramos gives us is that we need to be authentic. And he gives us an invitation that authenticity comes from the heart. It comes from a selfless place where we want to do what's right simply because it is right and because it helps others. This also reminds me of the cultural concept and ideology of Ubuntu. Ubuntu gives us an invitation. It says, I am because you are, and because we are collectively together. It's honoring that our human dignity, it's honoring a common purpose, and it helps to move us closer to a common destiny. The third premise that he leaves us with is that we must lead by example. He highlights here that most of us are familiar with the adage, actions speak louder than words. And he's given us opportunity to then be able to move beyond an idea of what inclusion could look like, beyond identifying diversity, multiculturalism, going through a cultural competency training to identify those ways where we each can create change in meaningful ways. This is just the beginning of the book. And I honor Miguel Ramos, who was the Senior Director of Diversity and Inclusion Strategy for the Minnesota Twins Baseball Club, for joining with me in that sense of often community organizers talk about of God voice, God power, that together we brought our voices in harmony to be able to say, this is the type of world, this is the type of workplace, this is the type of community that we can create today. So how do we do this? As a leadership scholar, it moves beyond leadership as a traditional notion of this idea that leadership is about a position, a title, or exercise of power. And it gives us a chance to reclaim leadership and redefine it and talk about leadership as a sense of purpose, as a sense of human dignity, and a sense of making the world a better place than how we found it. What better way then to reshape the narrative? And that's why I wrote The Inclusive Leader. I wanted to give that invitation that we all could delve deep and lead change in meaningful ways. Why is this important to me? Because in addition to being a leadership scholar, I'm also a civil rights attorney. My work focuses primarily on education and criminal justice disparities. And when doing that work, I oftentimes was tapping into the power of leadership, of asking those broader questions. For instance, what steps do we need to take when America has roughly 5% of the world's population, but nearly a quarter of the world's prison population? In addition to that, recognizing, as Dr. Cornel West said, that race does matter, and looking at the overrepresentation of Black males and also Black females in the criminal justice system. The inclusive leader takes those challenges and takes them as opportunities to help to create change. And in doing so, there's a 4-step process that I introduce in the book. It begins with that internal journey of making sure that we get a deeper understanding of who we are, what has been our journey related to diversity, what have been some of the experiences that have shaped our social consciousness. So let me just take to introduce those 4 different dimensions of inclusive leadership. The first one, that journey of self-discovery, is the intrapersonal journey. That's that opportunity to not only celebrate your cultural history and heritage and learn more, but also to challenge yourself around biases or stereotypes that are oftentimes, you hear it, the tip of the iceberg, that we may not necessarily see them. We may not proactively accept them. But for instance, if we're looking at unconscious bias, we know that it's there. Oftentimes we hear the notion that then the unconscious mind is basically steering the direction in which we go, whether it's making policies within our organization or shaping and creating misconceptions in some situations as well. No matter what it is, by going on this journey of self-discovery, you can help to see yourself more clearly, but also help to honor and create new connections across cultural differences. This leads us directly to the second dimension of our work in the Inclusive Leadership Challenge. This is related to the interpersonal work, asking ourselves how we interact with others. How do we build effective teams? And how do we leverage one of our greatest strengths of America is our cultural diversity. And what do I mean by that? Dr. Maya Angelou described our nation as a rich multicultural tapestry. She jumped into that notion that not one thread is greater than the other. And if we could bring every thread together, of course, that's where the magic happens. That's where innovation happens. That's when creativity happens. And if you don't believe me, let's look at the data. Whether you're looking at a report from Forbes, if you're looking at a report from Korn Ferry, or even if you're looking for a report, McKinsey, so some of the business scholars as well look at this. The ability to create innovative ideas, you're seeing it time and time again. The secret sauce, as they would say, related to diversity, that essence of what we can build and create together. Now, my research focuses primarily on racial and gender diversity, and we're seeing time and time again, based upon case studies, that if we can tap into diversity in meaningful ways, we can get a better bottom line, as we see evidence related to revenue, team cohesion. And then also, in a society now where we're facing challenges around employee retention, it creates inclusion, belongingness, which is the foundation of what not only helps to sustain retention, but also to sustain the ability to help bring forth promotion in our organizations too, because then we're cultivating talent and we're helping to create a necessary leadership pipeline that reflects our society and the beauty of it, which is multiculturalism. In addition, this leads us directly to the organizational side, the third dimension of the inclusive leader paradigm. This piece is related to establishing those type of strategic outcomes and promoting equity. Why is this important? Just one example. If we look at pay parity, and we're seeing then other organizations and states bringing forth specific policies related to this, salary transparency. We know where we sit today, African American female, to receive equal pay in 2023, it would take all the way up to summer 2024. The same is true for a Latina. For equal pay, it would take until not just summer 2024, but going into the fall. What does this mean for us? It means that we have to challenge and change policies, change the policies that do not bring forth equity in meaningful ways. Ensuring that we, for instance, have equal pay for equal work is a fundamental premise. What do all these things mean together? It means that the inclusive leader also activates their organization to help inspire change, to help talent rise, and to help to create a foundation where people can engage and work in meaningful ways. Last but not least, the fourth dimension, if we're going to take this inclusive leadership challenge, is related to societal. What type of world do we want the next generations to inherit? What an invitation. That's an invitation to each and every one of us to think about how we lead change. How do we celebrate our narratives? How do we also embrace our differences? But more importantly, how do we create an economy that works in meaningful ways, that engages each and every one of us, that helps to build strong families and safe communities? So as we look ahead to the societal side, it's looking at building the world of the future today. So what do all four pieces of these components have in common? It gives an invitation to a leadership journey where you can embark on a learning journey. Within each of these stages, you can make a commitment to serve as a leader who is that disruptor, that innovator, and that difference maker. So this book will give you those tools. I would like to conclude with just a brief passage from Justice Alan Z. Page, who is a retired justice from the Minnesota Supreme Court. And as I listened to him one day share a vision about what the future of leadership and society could be, I would be remiss not to share that vision is, but also to invite you in to bring your vision of the future. And let's help to mold a collective, strategic, and intentional action around justice and equity. So here it is. The conclusion of the book reads, The world is in a time of accelerated change. Each moment dramatically changes and shifts the economy, society, and environment, as evidenced by technological shifts, new product needs, a global pandemic, or a national crisis. No matter the issue, the call to inclusive leadership remains the same. Will you be prepared to lead your organization into the future? Technical competence and business acumen will be expected. But what is often overlooked is the importance of a unique composition of leadership skills that focus on advancing the principle of inclusion. Not an obligation to be relegated to a staff member, employee resource group, or committee. Rather, it's your responsibility. And when we look at this, when I say it's your responsibility, it's once again that leadership invitation for you and I. You not only by setting your organizational goals, you also chart the course across the difficult tides of modern business practice. This is about your leadership. You will guide your team as they navigate the course of making inclusion come alive in your organization. And for just a quick reference, here's a definition from the National Association for Diversity Officers in Higher Education from their standards of professional practice for chief diversity officers. They define inclusive excellence as follows. It starts at the highest level of administrative authority, is expressed prominently in institutional missions and strategic plans, and is supported through meaningful allocations of fiscal, human, and physical resources. Inclusion is a call to action each and every day. It requires deliberate and intentional action in order for inclusion to materialize. I close with the words of retired Minnesota Supreme Court Justice Alan Z. Page. How we act today and every day for the rest of our lives will define who we are. Today, make a commitment to serve as an inclusive leader. Define yourself as an innovator, builder, and change agent. So I hope that you will continue to join with me on this journey. Use the book, The Inclusive Leader, as a guide and a blueprint and a roadmap for how we can together create systemic and long-term change. Thank you for joining me and taking strategic and intentional action for justice and equity.
Greetings. I'm Dr. Leonard Weather, and my book, our new book, if you will, is Endometriosis, the Name of the Pain and How to Repress It. And this book essentially talks about the ins and outs of endometriosis. Endometriosis, for the most part, is a significant problem in this country and throughout the world. It's a female disorder that, in essence, causes a number of different symptoms, which we will go into. But really, the essence of why this book was written is because, and as you could see, the title, Endometriosis, the Name of the Pain, and How to Repress It, is because so many women, if you will, suffer tremendously, totally discombobulated, trials and tribulations related to serious pain. It takes an average 5 to 10 years before the average patient finds out she has endometriosis, and also about 5 doctors. And oftentimes they have unnecessary procedures or procedures that can even take away their fertility. So it is a major problem that is, in some sense, put off as if it's a minor issue such as severe cramps. So it's the case that this book gives information related to that and how you can actually get to the bottom of the problem and how you can basically have a better quality of life. And that's the essence of it. So I'm Dr. Leonard Weather, and I'm a gynecologist, trained at Howard University in pharmacy, went to Rush Medical College, and trained at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, Maryland, in gynecology and obstetrics. I'm also a clinical trials or clinical research. In fact, I'm president-elect of the Academy of the Physicians in Clinical Research, and I'll be installed in October. I'm additionally the past president of the National Medical Association and national president of Chi Delta Mu Medical Fraternity, which was founded at Howard University campus in 1913. So we'll proceed on with, here's the cover of the book, and of course the back of the book, and it's meant for a reason to be the wonderful, miraculous color of purple, spiritual strength, royalty, and we need to have that affair. We need to have a better quality of life, and to get to that is what and where we are. So what is endometriosis? As I talked about, it's where the lining of the uterus goes from the outside to other parts of the body. It can even go to the lungs, even to the eyes. That's uncommon, but this is something that can occur. It's a disease that causes significant issues and problems. The main problems are pelvic pain and infertility, inability to get pregnant, and severe debilitating pain. Often manifested as severe cramps. And when we talk about severe cramps and we talk about being able to attend or be attended to by a physician, then it's oftentimes stated to be just mild cramps. Here's oral contraceptives or birth control pills in order to be able to treat this problem. Well, the facts are it's not treating the problem. The facts are it actually hides the problem or delays the problem or kicks the can down the road so that later on when they get off the pill, then they have just enormous, ginormous pain that is unbearable in many instances. And this doesn't have to be in an adult. This can also occur in young girls. And it's a very common, unfortunate problem. So if we talk about a young girl who has trouble because with this severe pain and cramping and back pain and can't go to school, certainly something rotten in the city of Denmark, and we need to pay attention to that. So if a gynecologist is not able to really ascertain or be able to kind of drill into what is going on, then certainly there's a need to see other doctors. This perchance is a picture of the ovaries here, and of course some areas of endometriosis. So this is on the fallopian tube. The ovaries, additionally, can be in what this area here called the cul-de-sac. And of course, that's the uterus. So the fallopian tubes here, the ovaries here, and then of course the area here is the ligament that attaches to the uterus. And down here is another ligament called the uterosacral ligament. And this shows you the pervasiveness of endometriosis in the pelvis. It can occur not only in the pelvis, but as I stated, in the appendix, in the lungs, and other areas. And if one does have significant problems with pain, cyclic pain, then we really have to be concerned about the possibility of having endometriosis. So in terms of the symptoms I talked about, that pain is certainly one. Other symptoms can be dysmenorrhea, and we call it dysmenorrhea, frankly, painful periods, cyclic or non-cyclic pelvic pain. So if one is having pain, right-sided or left side, before, during, after the period, then of course we certainly think about the possibility of having endometriosis. Further, irregular heavy menstrual bleeding is another factor. Lower abdominal and low back pain. So lower abdominal pain, low back pain, leg pains before, during, or after the period. Dyschezia. When we talk about dyschezia, that's simply having painful defecation. If one is on the period and has pain with defecation, that's a concern for endometriosis. And beyond that, diarrhea before, during, or after the period, or nausea before, during, or after the period is another concern, along with constipation. And these things, as you can see, is applicable to the period. So if something's going on with around the period, before, during, or after, then we really have concerns about a hormonal problem. And endometriosis is a hormonal problem. Bloating, nausea, and vomiting, as we talked about. Additionally, having pain in the inguinal area, having trouble with urinating. So if we talk about having some discomfort, pain, lower or suprapubic pain around the period, then that too kind of makes us concerned about endometriosis, along with painful intercourse, if you will. Leg pains, back pains, we talked about that. And it's particularly germane if we are talking about pain that is right-sided or left-sided. In other words, if the pain every month is around the same place, same kind of location. And that's really what makes us wonder. So we can also have what's called non-menstrual pelvic pain, where pain occurs in between the cycle, right around the time that one would ovulate. And of course, shoulder and neck pain makes us be concerned about distant endometriosis. And distant endometriosis means that the endometriosis is no longer in the pelvis. It is in other areas, and it can be so severe that certainly can happen. And where every month one can have this significant or enormous pain on the right side in particular. And if that's true, then we are concerned about the possibility of endometriosis. So listening to the patient, we physicians or gynecologists basically will find out what she's going through, and then we're able to do the necessary testing and procedures to be able to find out not only is there endometriosis, but also the extent of endometriosis, and treat the problem, providing a better quality of life. So as we talked about, it's a uncommonly diagnosed, but a common problem. As a matter of fact, 6 out of 10 women are undiagnosed. That is 6 out of 10 undiagnosed. There's 6 million women with endometriosis in this country. 190 million people or women throughout the world that has endometriosis. And that's just a low estimate in terms of what is going on, because it's so unfortunately undiagnosed. Again, 5 doctors, 5 to 10 years before the average patient finds out she has endometriosis. And beyond that, there are many procedures being done to treat problems that is really not the problem, because we're not really drilling into getting and listening to what the patient is saying. There's now what's known as a clinical diagnosis, and that helps guide us. So if we listen to the complaints of the patient or the symptoms, then that kind of guides us to be able to get to the bottom of the problem. So here we're talking about the topics, and of course, the symptoms, as just stated or presented, are PARSH, the environmental toxins, another issue, another problem. And because we're talking about what causes this problem of endometriosis, well, we're still out on that. We're not certain what causes it, but we do know that that women who stay in certain areas, because the environmental toxins can cause endometriosis. So we know that, and of course, there's different studies that have shown this is the case. Obviously, there's other reasons why women may get endometriosis aside from the environmental toxins. And I would tell you that environmental toxins causes many of the problems. It's the wellspring of so many of the problems that African Americans or people blessed with color actually have. So many years ago, and certainly all of us have heard of this just incredible, miraculous genius, Marvin Gaye. And Marvin Gaye talked about with the ecology, mercy, mercy me. Where did all the blue skies go? Poison is the wind that blows from the east to the west. Fish full of mercury, oil and gas on ocean and seas. So back in 1971, Marvin Gaye talked about some of the problems that we're going through now. And obesity, the obesogens, so many of these toxins are estrogenic, and that causes other issues. And we could even be concerned about the various cancer, breast cancer, because of these estrogens. If a young lady, because we'll see here, or talk about later, adolescence, if someone's having a period at age 9, then that means that there is some issue with estrogens or estrogen disruptors, or hormonal disruptors. So we have to kind of connect the dots in terms of what's going on. So beyond the environmental toxins that in your neighborhood, we look at fibroid tumors. So often fibroid tumors gets blamed for endometriosis. And so frankly, talking about pain that happens every month, that's endometriosis, but fibroids getting the blame. Fibroids are there every day. And therefore, we're talking about if it's only around your cycle, it's really that of endometriosis, because fibroids should be causing pain every day since they're there every day. Cancer, another issue in terms of endometriosis, so it can occur. Rarely does endometriosis turn to cancer, but it's possible. Additionally, we have a number of different diagnostic treatments entities for endometriosis. We are able, if we listen to the patient, do the appropriate testing, we can make the diagnosis, and we have treatment. Incredibly game-changing treatments called GnRH antagonists today. We have alternative treatments. Alternative treatment may be, for some patients, particularly if we talk about the pain, it may be a function of using like acupuncture or using physical therapy, other different entities, but we do have alternative treatment for patients. And certainly diet is front and center in this, because if you're talking about antioxidants, because endometriosis is an inflammatory entity, then matcha or green tea and various other, like turmeric, is certainly helpful. So we do have alternative treatments. Clinical trials, it's important for clinical trials to be involved. We need to be involved with clinical trials, because if we're in the forefront of being able to be a part of this particular study, then we have medications that we are actually taking during the study that can actually help. So we certainly need to be involved with clinical trials. And of course, the Tuskegee has put some barriers or challenges, but that's the past. We're looking going forward. We're looking toward the future. So it's important and certainly very advantageous for us to be involved with clinical trials, clinical research. I talked about adolescents with endometriosis, and certainly if we have a young lady that has trouble with severe debilitating pain, until otherwise proven, it's likely to be endometriosis. It's important to make sure we do not stop, we do not pause. We need to go forward to make sure we get to the root of the problem, because endometriosis tends to get worse as one gets older, and therefore starting that young with severe debilitating pain truly affects her quality of life, affects her grades, affects her ability to be able to function. So that is why we really need to pay attention to adolescent endometriosis and the symptoms that this young lady may have. Unnecessary hysterectomies. So it is true that unnecessary hysterectomies is front and center. Unfortunately, many African-American women are faced with this. And it's the case that many of the women actually have this problem, that are victims of unnecessary hysterectomies because of the trust. So we should trust physicians, but we should verify, and we should, if need be, get a second opinion. But endometriosis, if it's treated by hysterectomy in many instances, then only 5% on the uterus. So patients may tend to have a continuation of pain, even though they had a hysterectomy. They don't have the bleeding, but they still may have this problem of pain. Race and endometriosis, there's really no space between Caucasians and Blacks in terms of endometriosis. Biologically, we're about 99.9% the same, but certainly disparities is an issue. Our zip code is an issue. So we're talking about the wellspring of so many of our problems is based upon what's in our neighborhood. And it's talked about 80% of people of color live in areas where there's hazardous waste. Hazardous waste, which can cause cancer, which can cause breast cancer. In fact, right in the city of New Orleans, there's a breast cancer cluster right in the heart of New Orleans. And so women that's in that area are faced with being victims or at risk for breast cancer. Beyond that, endometriosis and the future AI, this is something that is certainly we need to be mindful of. AI is moving along, it's helping, but we need to be able to not only be able to understand the extent of it, but we also need to use it for our betterment. But here's a doctor in terms of race, is Dr. Donald Chapman, who's passed, unfortunately, but a true hero. He was the first to say endometriosis does in fact occur in women of color. And he did his scientific paper, Endometriosis in the Black Woman, and was able to show. They still didn't believe him, but he had to go to Canada to get this paper, his scientific paper published and presented. So that's Dr. Donald Chapman from Baton Rouge, who lived in Chicago for many, many years. An incredible gynecologist. So in the Black woman, endometriosis, it's the diagnosis, the treatment. So it's his paper, misconception in terms of Black women, when they have pain, other problems, it's sexually transmitted disease. He was able to show this is not the case, that Black women have endometriosis. In fact, today we may say that Black women may have more because of the environmental toxins that's in their neighborhood. Whether you're rich or whether you are not rich or in between, then we're faced with we're in the same boat. That is, people of color. The zip code is an issue because in our neighborhoods, unfortunately, there are serious toxins. And this is my last case. This is the case I hope I never see again. This is an 18-year-old who actually received a hysterectomy. She presented to my office with complaints of severe pain, and I found out she had a hysterectomy, and the symptoms and problems that she presented with were frankly just the classical endometriosis symptom, but the young lady had a hysterectomy. Ovaries, uterus, tubes are all taken out. She still had the same pain. I did what's called a laparoscopy and was able to show that this is indeed endometriosis, which says that she could have been treated with the laser that I used and medications in lieu of a hysterectomy, so she could obviously never have a child. So I hope never to see this again, but it's not uncommon that women have unnecessary hysterectomies, particularly Black women. So we have to make sure, need be, get a second opinion, but do all you can to make sure that your problem is a problem A, B, C, or D. And oftentimes it's this severe debilitating cyclic pain that is monthly pain and cramping, back, leg, shoulder. It's endometriosis until otherwise proven. Endometriosis is the name of the pain and how to repress it. It's a valuable source of hope for learning or reviewing all the ins and outs of endometriosis. It's likely to assist those affected by it to have a better quality of life. And that's really the goal, is to have a better quality of life. So by allowing or giving this information about so many other areas that can cause problems, this book basically was written to make sure that we have the knowledge and the truth to be able to get to the wellspring of the problem, and then to have a better quality of life, to be able to have children, to be able to not have this serious pain. And that's what it's all about. So we have the knowledge and the truth in the book to be able to help guide and even protect, if you will, protect from unnecessary procedures, protect from this serious discomfort or being discombobulated or victim of this tumult related to having to suffer, and then being told it's nothing but simple cramps. And I've had hundreds of women that have been told by other practitioners that their pain was told to be just nothing but mild, simple cramps, no problem. But they, in essence, had trouble with their husband, trouble being able to function. And then to understand the name of the pain is really just, it's nothing. So now they know, with being able to get the diagnosis, they will know the name of the pain. And that in itself helps to be able to say this vein or this poison this problem I'm going through, I know the name, I feel better. And here's, of course, treatment, medications, or whatever, to be able to give them a better quality of life. And that's really the joy and the peace and of course, a lot of love with this. So for more information about endometriosis, fibroid tumors, infertility, or for presentations about women's health issues, please contact me. You can reach me at area code 318-671-5320, or you can also reach me by email, which drweather@att.net. And additionally, the book is available for purchase Amazon, also Barnes & Noble, or you can simply email drweather-indo@att.net. So I thank you, and God bless, and hopefully you'll have a better life. Reading the book, I think, will help get you to the right road at the right time for the right reason. Thank you.
Hello, Asala. My name is Carrie Yolucci, and I am a professor here in Rhode Island at Roger Williams University. I'm so happy to be with my co-author to share our book with you today.
And hello, this is Joy Spencer. Such a pleasure to be sharing our book with Asala. My name is Joy Spencer, and I am Dean and Professor at the University of California, Riverside.
Let's share a couple of pages about our book. So Joy and I have recently published a book called Anti-Blackness at School, creating affirming educational spaces for African-American students. We appreciate the opportunity to chat with you about our book and to share with you what we think is really important work. So if you are interested in purchasing this book, you can get it pretty much anywhere books are sold in a whole bunch of formats. So we hope you will take advantage.
So I really wanted to start off this talk because I think Woodson has always been an inspiration of mine, and even as a young person, I've read his work, and this book is really inspired in a lot of ways by many of the things that he says. But this idea that the thought of the inferiority of the Negro is drilled into him in almost every class he enters and in almost every book he studies. This notion that racism is not simply being called out, the N-word, but it's really receiving messaging about who you are. And that happens in school. School is a major place where anti-Blackness happens. So there are 4 goals that we had for this book. And very, very excited to share these. The first goal is that we really want to illuminate ways that anti-Blackness affects education. And we're going to have a little chat in a moment, but anti-Blackness is something that I think sometimes escapes people. They sometimes might think that, oh, well, this just happened in school. They're trying to place it. But they're trying to place it and they really can't. They might name it something else. But we wanted to illuminate in this book the ways that anti-Blackness actually does affect education. The book also explores ways in which diversity work is not the same thing as anti-racist work. And I think this is extremely important because a lot of times schools get caught up in doing multiculturalism, in doing anti-racist adjacent work, but it is not actually anti-racist work. And so we are really trying hard to nail and speak specifically to this notion of anti-racism and how you do that work in school. We then provide a model of a Black affirming space. In the book, for those who get it, I share quite a bit about a model of teaching STEM and STEAM practices to youth, to Black youth. And I think models speak 1,000 words because they illuminate so much about how you can do this kind of work in the context of schools. And then finally, we worked really hard. Carrie put in a ton of work on this, cataloging useful resources and concrete ways of pushing back on anti-Blackness for educators, teachers, principals, parents, and so forth. So that's what we are attempting to do in this book.
So for our conversation today, we thought it would be more interesting for the audience to chat with each other, just as 2 colleagues talking through our books. So I will ask a couple questions of Joy, and Joy will do the same of me, and hopefully we will get to share ourselves, our work, and our interest in this topic. So Joy, to start, thinking back on it now, it seems like a long time ago, but what was your original impetus for wanting to do this book, wanting to write this book?
Well, wow, as I have a few challenges here, I think, this is a book I've wanted to write for so many years. Being a Californian and a kid who grew up in California, post-Brown, post-civil rights, I think sometimes people are astounded when I say that I experienced a lot of racism in school. They can't really understand it. You grew up in LA, you grew up in California. And I think a lot of African Americans are in that space, in that context. They grew up in Michigan or places, Chicago, Denver, wherever it might be. and they experience a good deal of racism, but they aren't able to really express it in the same way because it's not the kind of racism that maybe our parents or grandparents dealt with, such as segregation, where you literally could not go to school with white folks. So I wanted to write this book to help parents get language for what their kids are experiencing. I wanted to help kids get language for what they're experiencing in school. I guess selfishly, I wanted to share a little bit about what I experienced and to help demonstrate how racism and anti-racism is something that kids actually do experience, and that oftentimes they don't have a way to describe what is being done to them. I think the nuances of racism are really, really important for educators to understand. And sometimes you'll hear educators say, well, I treat all kids the same. And that cannot be the case because the outcomes in schools are so profoundly inequitable that we know something is going on. And so I really wanted to write this book to help illuminate and help us understand and pull back why we have such diverse and inequitable outcomes in schools. And racism is a really, really important way to help explain what's going on.
Thanks, Joy.
Okay, Carrie, you're up next. My question to you is, what do you want people to take away from this book?
So I think it depends on the audience, Joy. So when I'm talking to white teachers, I hope that they take away the reality that racism is real and it's real every day, versus the sense that sometimes racism, and we're seeing that right now, right, in politics and in the media, that racism has been chalked up as someone's political opinion, or, that we live in some post-racial world right now, and none of those things are true. And so to be able to help white teachers to walk with their Black kids and see their lived experiences through their own eyes, right? And to honor that. So for me, it's really important that white teachers honor the stories of Black kids, understand their interpretation of how they are experiencing their lives in schools, and then work to push back against the buckets of anti-Blackness that Black children have to face in classrooms. For Black teachers and Black colleagues, I hope they take away a sense of togetherness, or that there's a community of folks who are doing this work. I know sometimes, so former classroom teachers, you feel like you're the only lighthouse out there and you're just trying to stand up against the storm, but the potential of you drowning is really, really high. But I think every time you turn around, as much as you hear this anger and kind of like normalized hatred right now, there's also tons of folks in your corner who are doing like-minded work, who have your back, and kind of widening out that network is really important to me, of just seeing there are things that we can do. That's part of what we are doing with anti-racist at schools, is really laying out, okay, you can do this in the classroom as it pertains to discipline, or in building family relations, or in de-whitening your curriculum. And so hopefully that little spark is picked up by my Black colleagues who are working in schools right now.
Well, thank you. Wow.
My next question for you, Joy, is what did you learn? So I think we're both professors, we're often in the teaching role, but what did you learn a little bit of while now, right? We've got a couple of months behind us from the book being published. What are you taking away?
Great. I love this question. I think writing this book was reinforcement for many things that I was taught as a young person and as an educator. One of the things that was a really fun part of this book for me was helping to connect the dots around the legacy of African American educators, how folks like Woodson, Mary McLeod Bethune, Frederick Douglass, and we even pick up on Gloria Ladson Billings, how they are really carrying on this long-standing, the educators in school today are just carrying on a long-standing legacy And so one of the things I really learned, I got to really delve into the lives of our historic educators. So learning about Woodson even more and how he was so committed to teachers and teaching, learning about the sacrifices that Bethune made as she worked so hard to build Bethune-Cookman Institute, and just this notion that Black education and this commitment to Black education, it has always been there. And that when we talk about doing anti-racist work in school, we're really just naming how to continue this work. It's a through line. Brown versus Board of Education, for some people, they might think, well, that's a stop along the way. Perhaps. But that is we had educators then really pushing for profound opportunities, the opportunity, to have equal educational opportunity. This idea that education is a liberating force, that wasn't new for Brown. It wasn't new before, when those folks who were enslaved were running schools for their kids, hidden, learning their alphabet by writing in the dirt. This is just a through line all the way to what we see happening in school today. And I hope that this book in some way is sort of like another little, teeny tiny way, a little stop along like a number line, a through line to education really being this transformative opportunity for our people.
So a continued resistance here.
Yeah, I think so. Indeed.
Definitely. All right.
Okay, Carrie, who do you recommend this book to? Who should read this?
So I think for folks who might be joining us and seeing that the title is Anti-Blackness in School, the obvious choice would be teachers and administrators in schools, and that's true. So this book was written definitely with K-12 educators in mind, folks who are learning to become teachers and administrators who'd like to do things differently in their school. That said, I think that the interest in the book, or at least our intention, is much wider, right? So like you said at the very beginning of our questions, the goal for us was basically to give families language to push back on some of the anti-Blackness that they're seeing. I know sometimes I'll have African-American students, even at the university level, who will say, I knew all these things were happening to me, but I didn't understand what to call them or how to piece them together or where to see the history and where I'm at now as linking together. So as much as it's written for teachers, it was written very much with a very open language, trying to be super inclusive of all manners of audiences, because anti-Blackness affects children, thus it affects all of us, right? So it affects grandma, and it affects that 12th grade teacher, and moms and grandparents just the same. So I appreciate that it feels like it sits in schools, at least with the goal for the book, but I think it's just a topic that everyone can get something out of. All right, so those are our 4 questions that we had wanted to share with each other. So we're going to wrap up our time in this virtual book talk by just sharing with you our email addresses and where you can reach us. We want to just highlight the fact that, we said one of our goals is community building. So there's ways that we can link with what you're doing in your worlds. Please reach out to us. Joy, final thoughts?
We hope you pick up the book. I think that we're often inundated with so much about how to improve education, and this book is different. Carrie and I have collectively 40 plus years as educators, as teachers, as professors, dean, and we have been very thoughtful about ways that African American kids have been impacted by schools. And I think that there's a lot to learn from this book, and it's an offering. And so we hope that you take the time to read it. It's small, but I think it's mighty. And I think the resources are also something that any educator, parent, anyone who runs a nonprofit organization can pick up and read and use in a few days. So that's my final few cents.
Great. Thank you, and happy conference.
Take care.